Hello and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is Nancy Billiou, author of the Tudor Joanna Stafford trilogy of books, The Crown, The Chalice and The Tapestry, as well as the standalone novel, The Billiou, and the forthcoming in 3 days, Dreamland. Welcome, Nancy.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad to be speaking to you. I'm a big fan of your reviews, and I'm a subscriber to your email newsletter, so this is a thrill.
Thank you. I will watch what I say.
That's okay. Please be honest.
So you've been on the staff of various magazines and you contribute now regularly to others. And I know we've been talking about that before we started recording. And, you know, I would love to talk about that, but we're talking about books. Did you always hope to write novels as well?
It's funny because I wanted to write novels when I was very young, when I was in middle school and high school. I had all of these aspirations. I was writing poems and so forth. And then when I got into university, I totally switched over to being a journalist. And all I could think of was getting a job as a journalist, a writer, and an editor. And then I still read fiction, but it wasn't something that I thought I would do. And it's sort of funny that there was this diverging. And then after I'd been in the magazine business a while, I had my first child. I was sort of, maybe I was tired of journalism and nonfiction and reading a lot of fiction and just sort of thinking, well, maybe I could do this. And I joined a workshop for aspiring novelists and just started bringing in some pages of what became The Crown. So that was the first novel I attempted, but it wasn't an overnight thing. It took me about 5 years on and off to get it so that an agent would sign me. So it was quite a lot of work. And starting over, revising. I think that a lot of people with their first book go through that.
So you don't have, I suppose it's a stereotypical novel in your drawer, the first novel in your drawer then? Your novel was The Crown?
Yes, but I had done some screenwriting before then. And those were stories. And none of them got none of them made it to the big screen, which is very hard to do, to be fair to myself. It's hard to see your screenplay make it all the way. But I did have that experience of writing, and I wrote 3 different stories. 2 of them were historical because of such a history, obsessive person. And so I kind of got a lot of structure and visual writing. I worked on a lot in the screenwriting, so I kind of brought all that with me. So it wasn't the first time I tried to tell a historical story when I did The Crown, but it was the first novel. And in fact, The Crown is the most like a screenplay, if you know it like I do, because it's the most filmic. Because I was still sort of very attached to my screenwriting and my descriptive tools. So with each book, I think I get a little bit better at sort of keeping what's good about screenwriting, but you have to move into more and more into the novel world, which is very different, very interior at times, which you can't be interior with a screenplay.
Now that's very interesting to hear because it kind of blends into the idea of the research that, I've always read your books, and if I'm playing an association game, I suppose, Nancy Billiou for me is followed by the word research and description, and the sheer amount of research you do is something, I've always noticed it. It leaps off the page, but I mean, for anyone who's listening and just thought, oh gosh, this amount of research sounds quite a lot, it never goes into info dumping territory. It's just fantastic. So where do you head to sources wise when you're first thinking about a book?
Well, with The Crown, it was the one that was the most daunting because I was writing it in New York about a country I don't live in, and I was not raised Catholic, and I'm writing, although I was baptized Catholic secretly. It's a long story by my grandparents.
That's very interesting to hear, yeah.
My parents were sort of like very, almost like hippies, not really extreme ones, but they were free-thinking and agnostic. And they both came from religious families, and they rejected that. And they raised me in that way. And I found out when my grandmother was dying when I was 19 that when she and my grandfather were babysitting in Chicago when I was, maybe 6 months old or younger, they were horrified at what was happening. They were very observant Catholics, Irish Catholic, and they took me to a priest while they were babysitting and didn't tell my parents and had me baptized. At first, they tried a young priest who was their parish priest, and he said, no, I would have to have the consent of the parents. And so they went back. The next time they were babysitting, they went to an old priest, and he said, I will do it. So I found out when I was 19. So after that, I was very fascinated with Catholicism. And I would go into cathedrals and sort of stand there, like St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is beautiful, and in New York. And I would think, okay, do I belong here? So I was drawn to Catholicism without being raised in it. And I think that gave me some outsider view of it. And also, I wasn't too intimidated because I didn't actually know what I was taking on. So I was trying to write about a world that had been gone for quite a long time. And by that, I mean like completely gone, demolished. And it took me a while, but I finally found, because my books are based on a real Dominican house of nuns in Dartford in Kent. And I did find some scholarship about the place, and I found records of the names of the nuns who were there at the dissolution by Henry VIII, and I finally found some in a book. I found some letters from the prioress, sort of complaining about various things, and then I love that. And then I found through my research, because what really bothered me was very hard for me. I get sort of stuck on various things, and I was stuck on wanting to know what was daily life. I know there's a lot of prayer, but where would they sleep? How would they? I was told there were hardly any fires in these monasteries, and a lot of them were semi-open. How could you even survive the winter? So I had all these questions. Sleeping, eating, and then I wanted to know about all of the spiritual matters. So I read some books that were written by real nuns earlier, and often not in England, like Catherine of Siena and so forth. And I started to read these sort of mesmerizing, these first-person accounts. A lot of these women were, they weren't sleeping much. They were in a real state, almost a hallucinatory state of, and a lot of it was ecstasy. It was just not what you think. A lot of the stereotype of the nun is, especially in, I don't know about other places, but here, New York, there's a lot of Catholic schools. It's the nun who's like rapping your knuckles with a ruler and is mean. Mm-hmm. And the stereotype of the historical nun is it's someone who was forced there by parents, doesn't want to be there. So I found that a lot when it came to the Tudor era and earlier that wasn't the case. And from what I could research, that there was a genuine calling from many of these women. And after Henry VIII had them, forced to the dissolution, and a lot of them were forced to leave, a lot of them didn't want to re-enter society, and they sort of lived in small groups, still trying to carry out their own way of life. And then when Mary Tudor, came and tried to bring Catholicism back, they joyfully rushed back to their former, not all of them, but a substantive number. So there was really, much more of a commitment and a spirituality, and I found that interesting. So, but the origin of the crown was I wanted to do a mystery in the Tudor era. I was always interested in the Tudors, but I didn't want to do a royals story. I just felt that they'd been done, and I didn't really have anything interesting or original that I could bring to this from a royal point of view. So I thought, well, who would be going through extreme experiences who would be very interesting to have in the middle of something? And I thought, well, a nun, and it's kind of funny because the more I studied it and the more I got into it, the more I started to identify with the nuns and the friars and the monks. And, and so sometimes, I get all worked up, and I almost, I'm running around defending them. And it's funny because then people think, oh, well, you're some sort of rabid Catholic or something, which I'm not. But I did, through this intense research, feel like, there was a story there that wasn't told very much, of women who were living a life. There was more independence in those nunneries than there was outside of them. Often they were teaching. In fact, there wasn't much teaching of young women to read for quite a while after that. They were the ones who were teaching the young girls to read. And there was music, there was study. What there wasn't was, getting married and having children. So, but of course, we have modern research that says that there's a lot of longevity to that. And I have 2 children myself, so what can I say? I obviously didn't choose anything like a nun's life, but I do find it very interesting. So I did that. I found a lot of books, but then because I'm a journalist, I just started to bother people, and I sent emails to Tower of London, contact me. I didn't have any great insider techniques here. I just bothered the contact me people till they gave me a curatorial intern. And I was able to pepper her with questions, and she started to send me back PDFs, with information. Because again, I was sort of stuck on, okay, people are in these cells. Is it just sort of like, is it like a horror movie of constant torture, or what was it really like in there? So I just always felt like I had to have some understanding, because which is different from a lot of historical fiction, especially if it has a royal's point of view. And some of these books are very good. But if you read them, they don't spend any time with sort of ordinary life. They stay in the dialogue and the sort of pitch of, very important people going back and forth, divorcing, marrying, fighting, executing. You know what I mean? And it never, and I can see why, they don't really have time to stop everything and talk about. But I kind of yearn for those little details to sort of weave them in, so it's always exciting to find them. So so I bothered people, and then I did travel to Kent, and I took the train, and there's actually a museum there that's dedicated to the historical sites of Dartford, emphasizing the religious places. It's tiny. There's 2 men working there, and again, I think they thought, what is this woman doing? I just kept sending them more emails, and then I came in, and I wanted to take them to lunch, and they said, well, that's not appropriate for you to pay. They were so ethical. I was so surprised. I said, well, I'm not trying to bribe you. I just want to say thank you by buying you a sandwich or something, but they were so proper about it, so it was kind of sweet.
If there is a website for Dartford Museum, it will be in the description for you listeners.
They are
yes,
interesting place. They have some historical objects that have been found that are centuries old. And I love that stuff. Found in the foundations of the ruined castles and monasteries. These tiny objects. I'm just a sucker for that, and they have it, and they have some very nice exhibits.
So you have picked a reading from The Crown,
right?
And shall we start our main conversation with that?
Sure. All right, Chapter 4. I watched the sun slip down behind the church spires of London. There was no more fine drizzle. By late afternoon, the sun had become a fiery orb, shriveling all the clouds and devouring the clammy mist that clung to feet and wheels and horses' hooves. As that sun now trembled atop the crowded western horizon, my eyes itched and stung, though whether it was because of the sun's rays or the black smoke of Smithfield from hours past, I couldn't tell. I sat facing backward in a Royal River barge, my wrists shackled. I couldn't see where I was going, but I felt the sureness of the 4 oarsmen's sticks, their deep rowing. These men, wearing the green and white livery of the House of Tudor, knew my destination. And the other boats on the Thames, even the Londoners on the shores, I was certain that they knew. Whenever we passed someone, I could feel the curious stares crawling over me, hear the burst of gossip. Who's that they've got there? An old woman dumping slop jars into the river watched me for as long as she could, her neck craning while she leaned out. So far I expected her to fall in. All of the time I sat straight and still, my shoulders as far back and my chin as high up as I had been schooled from the time I could walk. I didn't want to show my fear. And I most definitely didn't want anyone to see the man lying on the bottom of the barge, his bandaged head propped up on my skirts. My calves ached from the pressure of Geoffrey Scoville's head, but I couldn't send him back down onto the wet bottom of the barge. His slack face, his closed eyes, the trickle of dried blood on his right cheek filled me with furious guilt. I had so much to think about, to pray over, to try to understand before arriving at whatever place they were taking me to. But here was an immediate difficulty, thrown into my very lap. Just as the sun disappeared, and a sickly dusk bathed the river in orange-violet light, Geoffrey woke with a groan. His wrists were unshackled, and he reached out, feeling the bandage around his head with confusion. Slowly, shakily, he sat up and turned to face me, heaving himself up to find a seat. Uncertain eyes met mine, and I dreaded the coming confrontation. "Do you know where you are?" I asked. Recognition filled his face. "I appear to be in a barge," he said. "A king's barge. Why?" I looked forward at one pair of oarsmen at the bow and peered behind at the other. The barge was so long that they might not be able to hear us. "I've been arrested with my father, and I believe you've been arrested as well," I said softly. He took it much better than I expected. His face stayed calm. "What are the charges?" "I don't know," I replied. "I told them my name and my father's name, and then they went away for a long time, and they left me under guard. They put us both in a wagon, and we went to a building. But then they seemed to change their minds and brought us to the river. We sat in the wagon for 2 hours before they put us into this boat. I never saw my father again. I know he was injured, much worse than you, but no one would tell me anything."
In this book, we've obviously introduced quite a bit of it, but following on from this, Joanna is tasked by Bishop Stephen Gardiner to find out where the crown of King Athelstan, who was the Anglo-Saxon king of England from the year 894 to 939, where this crown has been hidden. Gardiner believes the crown is at Joanna's priory, and the reason he gives her for finding it is that he will save her father, who has been arrested and is in the Tower of London. To find out why, you'll have to read the book, or reread it if you've done so already and can't remember, because I confess I couldn't. It was several years ago that I read this book, so I have reread it as well. So the trilogy is great. You know, we've already said you've got loads of research, and the choice of main character is great. So how much work was it to get around the issue of Reformation?
Well, it was quite a lot because I was on the unpopular side of it. And I often felt a little defensive, although there are wonderful writers doing journalism and scholarship. I think I'm the only one who's writing fiction from that point of view. When I visited London after I'd sold The Crown to Orion, and my editor, I was working on the Chalice, took me to the theater, and she said, well, we can see, she says, I want to take the theater. I can take you to Faust or Anne Boleyn. And I really wanted to see Faust, but she said quickly, I assume Anne Boleyn is what you want to see. I said, well, of course, anything would be wonderful. So we went, and of course, I'm sitting there, and, there's jokes about the monks who are, molesting boys and, so forth. It's very, the Catholics are beyond reproach type of humor. And everybody's laughing. I thought, I don't know. I don't feel comfortable, but, I'm not really fitting into this point of view where it's, automatically all of the Catholics are just terrible people. And it's a system that has to be swept away. And there are different points of view on this about whether, it was so irredeemable. I mean, definitely it wasn't led by pure religious reform. It was led by Henry VIII's frantic desire to divorce his wife, to get an annulment to be accurate, and marry again to have an heir, and the Pope's refusal to give him what he wanted. So, the origin is not pure. And then the money from the dissolution, including the destruction of Dartford, all went into the treasury. That's a subject of some controversy because supposedly Anne Boleyn, in fact, there's debates about that going on now, that she wanted some of this money to go to the poor or various things like that. And instead it all went in the treasury. And in fact, one of the things that I write about in my books, which I found so ironic, is Henry VIII used a lot of the money from the dissolution to buy tapestries. He was a real collector. he really he was such a rapacious collector.
Of these Catholic tapestries.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the tapestries are based on paintings of Raphael, of beautiful passages of they look like something in the Sistine Chapel. But he also wanted tapestries that sort of built up passages from the Bible that he could relate to. He saw that was a modern day, biblical figure bringing justice. But yeah, he spent the amount that you would spend on a warship on a series of tapestries. He was one of the premier collectors. Now, he also loved, as everyone knows, clothing, jewelry, armor. He was just extremely extravagant. He also had very good taste. His tapestry collecting was superb. And when people look at the counting lists of what was left when he died, it's just mind-boggling. He lived extremely well. I don't think anybody built more than he did either. So a lot of the money that he got sacking all the monasteries went toward also defense, as he felt he was going to be invaded at any time by the France or Spain, or the two of them together. So he had to defend the kingdom, but also to live well, which he did. He didn't leave much for his son when he died. And of course he's an interesting figure. And I've seen all of the movies and I've seen all of the TV series, maybe not all of them, but many of them. At this point, I feel like I need a break because there's only so many Henry VIIIs you can see. But it is extremely interesting. It's just, people come to it and then they have all the same questions that someone has at the beginning. And it's sort of funny to have people subtly saying, well, why did he really kill Anne Boleyn? It's just like, oh, no, I don't want to go through this because it's just been written about so much.
Well, you'll be glad to know that I have a question about Henry's wives, but I decided not to make it about Anne Boleyn. So you're okay.
She's a fascinating person, there's no doubt.
Oh, and definitely, yes.
And, look at her daughter. But, it just gets to be overload. And that's why I felt like I didn't want to be the 1,000th writer to write about Anne Boleyn. I actually like Nora Lofts. I discovered her historical fiction. She wrote a book called The Concubine about Anne Boleyn, which I think is very good, very well written and very original. But, others take a viewpoint, either she's a sexy temptress or she's a cold-hearted, incestuous. It just goes on. And it, obviously interesting to thousands of people.
So we've kind of brought in the tapestry accidentally almost, I suppose. And as said, you cover Henry's wives. Was there a particular reason, other than not wanting to talk about Anne Boleyn, that you wanted to focus on Catherine Howard?
Well, she just fit in with the time that I was trying to do. And also, I've always found her quite a sad figure because, she came from a very neglected background. All of the other wives had many more advantages and more education and more guidance. And she was basically orphaned. And then, her father was alive for quite a while, but he had nothing to do with her. He had a new wife and he was a mess. So she was left basically parentless and not very educated. And, it's just sort of, to me, bizarre that he would feel that this very young girl was appropriate Queen of England. It was such a fluke. But I guess it was like the king of all midlife crises. And I had read a little bit about her, that she's not quite the vapid slut that a lot of people assume, that she did make a lot of efforts while she was queen to do things that you are supposed to be doing. She tried to sponsor various people. She tried to defend people. She tried to speak up for people who needed defense. And she had this very terrifying older husband. So I found her interesting. All the wives to me are very interesting women. Even Anne of Cleves's. There was a new nonfiction book by a historian, Heather Darcy, about how we've all been thinking about Anne of Cleves the wrong way, that actually there's a lot of things to learn by reading documents in Germany about what really happened in that marriage. So I like that there are still areas that can be mined, by, writers who are resourceful and can get new documents and new ways of thinking. But yeah, Catherine Howard, to be honest, because I wanted the first book to follow a certain real timeline. At the beginning of The Crown, that's a real person who's burned, Margaret Bulmer, and she, dies in 1537. So, if you're going to start there and end in a certain place, you've already, in 1537, Anne Boleyn is dead. So you have to sort of pick someone and go with that person. And I also have Mary Tudor in all of the books, weaving in and out. And Stephen Gardner is my antagonist. Wiley Winchester, he's a fun antagonist to write. So there's various people that come in and out, as well as fictional people. So I kind of combine them, although I'm not alone in doing that. C.J. Sansom, of course, does that, and other historical mystery writers who set their books in, like the Brother Cadfael books had the real King Stephen in there, and so forth. So it's fun. It's sort of irresistible, really, to try your hand at writing these famous figures, And I had a friend who said, I like whenever the Duke of Norfolk would come in, I would get excited because he was always so horrible, just yelling at people, being a terrible human. And I'm like, oh, good, she's got Norfolk coming in because she has the best Norfolk. So it's kind of funny how we all have created our own versions of these real people. And then it's just a matter of being consistent through the books. But also I tried to put some of them on an arc where they, like Gardner in the end is not the totally reprehensible person, maybe. Shouldn't do spoilers, but I tried to see the good and bad in all of these people, even Henry VIII. I tried to see some of the good in him.
That's something that I know I kind of thought about when I first read The Crown, and the way the factual content is just so well mixed in, and it is something that is wonderful about those books.
Oh, good. I'm glad that you like that. That really makes me feel good.
So, can you tell us more about Joanna? Is she based on anyone in particular? She's totally fictional. I wanted someone who felt a little bit as an outsider, and that's why I made her mother Spanish. And I wanted an aristocrat who, perhaps that's why I like Catherine Howard too, who wasn't really getting a lot of the benefits of being an aristocrat. She's from the Stafford family, and I find the Staffords very interesting, that they came very close, especially in the reign of Richard III, to being in the first rank, maybe even taking the throne, but they couldn't quite get it together. And they fell back. And by the time of the end of Henry VIII's reign, they were nowhere. So, that's what's interesting about the Tudors, is that these families could rise, and boy, could they fall. So I wanted to have someone who, from that background, I thought it would be interesting that she had some exposure. She was educated, and she had witnessed important people like the Duke of Buckingham up close, but not as I didn't want somebody who already had everything the way they wanted. That's not an interesting person to write about. So I have a tendency to have women who are sort of struggling up in some way out of their circumstances. Well, no, like you said earlier, you've got these characters. You've got a bit of royalty in there, but there's so much about the average person's world. It's a very interesting part of the history, but it just doesn't get covered as much in fiction. So, yeah, that's great.
Well, what I wanted to do was to really think about someone who did submit to Henry VIII for fear of their life. And, I don't want to give away who that was, but someone who would, because there's some people who didn't. They were murderers, and they died horribly, the Carthusian monks and so forth. So what would it be like, even though, your conscience was very important to you back then, your spiritual life was everything, for you to submit just out of fear, just to stay alive? But then how do you live with yourself after that? So that, there are some people who are famous for not really having a lot of trouble with that, like the Richard Riches of the world. But in Man for All Seasons, they do such a good job for that. But what would it be like for an ordinary person to have that kind of guilt?
The Athelstan crown, it's an important part of the book. Is it a real object or inspired by anything?
Yes, I did find some wonderful research. I found a doctoral paper, and also like a 50-year-old book, sort of not quite a whole book, maybe a scholarly dissertation. What happened was that Athelstan was a up-and-coming charismatic king, and the King of France was trying to get into his good graces, get him to marry one of his sisters, so forth. And some very important relics passed into England at this time. And Athelstan, who was quite religious, as almost all kings were, very pious man, he did have some very important relics, and there is some question of which ones he had. Now, whether you want to say that these were the actual relics at the time of the life of Jesus is another matter. But there is an object called the crown of thorns, was supposed to have been worn by Jesus, that is, in Europe there. But there are several crowns that have been talked about through history. And there's a question of some of them pass in and out of various countries, various kingdoms. Sometimes they're stolen. Sometimes desperately poor kings ransom out of a situation with a relic. The crown is the one where I just go whole hog on my relic fascination. But I just find them interesting for various reasons. I mean, they're hidden treasure. You could just look at it from that point of view, trying to chart where they went. And then you think about what they meant to people. And then you think about, how close they really were to that certain period. And then, of course, relics are very important during the dissolution because there were some that were faked. There was one, I think, at Hales. There was a abbey where they were faking the blood of Jesus. They would shake a vial, and it was used as a way to get some donations. And this is obviously not good. So you look at these relics from all different points of view, both literal and also as a fun sort of treasure hunting way, and then spiritual. Now, I did find, though, that that Athelstan definitely had some relics, and also that he had a very special relationship with certain monasteries. And then, with the founding of Dartford, I did a lot of research in its very early stages with Edward II and Edward III and the Black Prince. There were sort of breadcrumb trails of history that I was following and building it up. So a lot of it is based on facts that I found. It did seem that it was very important to found this monastery, the Dartford nunnery, called a priory usually. And why was it so important? And there were certain royal people who lived there, or noble people who lived there, and there were certain letters that went back and forth. It seemed kind of mysterious. So I just sort of built on that.
Yes. You talking about relics, I've got things in my head that I've seen when I went to different countries and stuff. It's interesting how many there are of different things. So to move on to still the same book, but move on to a different subject entirely. There are a number of times in this trilogy when we see prejudice and outright discrimination towards women, and of course nuns in particular. There's one section, though, that takes up a lot of the sisters' literal time. So you have a feast given at Dartford Priory for a lord, and the events and preparations are far from what usually happens at the priory. It's quite offensive to the nuns, really, and they have to cook meat when they don't have much meat in their diet at all, and so on. Was this the sort of thing that happened in convents and monasteries at that time?
Yes, they were sometimes pressured to be sort of places of hospitality by the local lords, which is a huge offense against what they were supposed to be, especially a place like Dartford, which is enclosed. And, they don't go out into the community and teach. Everybody has to come in. So I did find that there was some of these, they're almost used as fancy hotels of the time. And some of the queens died in these places. Elizabeth Woodville died in a nunnery. They were used sort of as very nice situations for people who couldn't be in the court anymore, but you didn't want to pay for them to have a new castle somewhere. So you'd put them in a nunnery, just even though they were anything but a nun, and just live there. So there was some pressure put on nuns and monks to offer hospitality. Now, it never got to the point that I could find that it would get debauched or anything like that. Maybe things like that were happening, but there was some pressure.
Yes, I wondered if it was factual. It seemed Well, it was offensive enough to be factual, I thought. So moving on to your fourth book, but your second story overall, The Blue. It's set in the 1700s, and it's about a young English woman of French heritage from the Huguenots who wants to become an artist. And she meets a man higher in society who says that he'll give her some help to get to Europe to study painting if she can find out the formula for the new shade of blue the Derby porcelain factory is creating. So shall we have the reading from The Blue?
Sure. This is the absolute beginning of The Blue. Amiability has never been counted more important in a woman's character than it is today, which is why I am 24 and unmarried and without friends or an employer, only a grandfather for company. It doesn't matter. Ambition consumes me, an impossible one. It's what delivers me into the back of a hackney carriage on this December night, holding a party invitation that does not bear my name as I make my way from Spitalfields to Lesterfields. My grandfather and I live on Fournier Street, one of the most respectable in Spitalfields, a street where, never mind the longing and greed and fear that nibble at the souls of a good many neighbors, all say their prayers after supper and snuff the candles. Not so along the route through London to Lesterfields. From my swaying carriage, I see lights leaping in many windows and hear the shouts and the laughter. London is alive, and so am I. After more than an hour, the carriage jerks to a stop, as it has many times, but on this occasion, it's not in order to allow another to rumble forward. Thump! The driver pounds his stick. I've arrived. The carriage door swings open to number 30, Lesterfields, the home of England's greatest living painter, William Hogarth. As I step down, I catch sight of handsome houses rising along each side of the square, illuminated by cold-lit street lamps that stand to attention like tireless soldiers. The largest by far is Leicester House, tucked behind a courtyard, containing whichever Prince of Wales is presently draining the country of gold with his peevish schemes. I know from the newspapers the names of some of the other residents, wealthy doctors and striving merchants and low-rung nobles, but now is not the time to gawk. I'm not sure what I expected from Hogarth's London home. The solid terraced building, third from the left on the southeast corner, gives no outward evidence of artistic genius. Yet I know I've come to the right place, by the lights bursting from the windows and the roar of many voices. This is the man's Christmas party. I fully expect the servant at the door to give me trouble. Raising my chin, I try to look as if I belong in the rarefied world of Lesterfields. Unfortunately, a bitter cold wind envelops me, making my earrings, the only ones I possess, sputter against my neck. I shiver in my dress. I did not bring my winter cloak. How could I? It's much too plain, the garment of a modest, God-fearing Huguenot woman of Spitalfields, not the West End. Sober manner and somber dress, such is our creed. Without a word, I thrust the invitation into the gloved hand of the silver-wigged servant. He does not look down at the card. Have you no escort? None is required. He peers at the writing and frowns. This was sent to Pierre Billiou. My name is Genevieve Planchet, and I am his family, his granddaughter. My mother died of smallpox when I was 8. My father being dead of typhus 3 years before that, Pierre has long been my only family. I say, as casually as I can manage, grandfather is ill, but he wished me to convey to Mr. William Hogarth in person his wishes for a Merry Christmas. The servant purses his lips. I take a step closer. I'm sure Mr. Hogarth would be most angry to know that a member of the Billiou family was made to feel unwelcome. A smile crinkles the servant's face. With a mocking flourish, he beckons for me to enter. I straighten my shoulders and follow him, determined to maintain the appearance of being accustomed to such occasions. The truth is, I've only attended 2 artists' gatherings hosted by my grandfather, and they consisted of 3 or 4 of his old friends grumbling about their commissions over cognac. I've never attended a party among London society in my life.
Genevieve is a great character. I love that chapter to bits.
Oh, good.
The invitation, the situation of the invitation needs no further explanation. It's exactly what you think of the time period. But what was the position of women artists in those days?
Well, what I found was that there were some women who were decorative artists. And by that I mean like Anna Maria Garthwaite, who I know at Victoria and Albert, they have a lot of exhibits that have to do with her. She was working with the silk weavers, these beautiful silk dresses, making them sure that they had flowers on them or fruit or were decorated. And then there were also some women, not many, but some women who painted porcelain, and that becomes important in this book. And then the wealthier women or middle-class women would paint as a hobby, but you did not have any women fine artists yet in England that I could find. It's possible that there were some I missed who maybe were painting quietly in their homes.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah.
We would never know about them.
Yeah, but not exhibiting, and not, I mean, the biggest barrier besides just plain old sexism was, you had to go through a lot of training. You had to go through learning how to be a history painter. And by that I mean, the big biblical classical scenes, you had to learn how to paint the figures. And for that, you had to have models. And the models were usually nude. And there was this feeling that you absolutely could not have women artists in the presence of a nude model. I know that was a big barrier. And I think it was also just the feeling that, you didn't have women yet playing a role in high culture. It just hadn't quite happened yet in the 1750s. So you didn't have any Jane Austens or anything running around, or Mary Wollstonecraft. So she really wants to be a real artist, and there's just huge burdens in the way. And it was the same in France. The first woman artist, her name escapes me right now, but she painted Marie Antoinette quite a bit. And she was the daughter of an artist and then married another artist. It would take a village. You'd have to have a lot of family members and friends and connections behind you to help you get this training. Because it's not it's impossible to compare it to now, but you can express yourself artistically without a huge amount of training now in many ways. And you can teach yourself. But back then you had to have an apprenticeship. There was a lot of technique. So even if you had a lot of raw talent, somebody had to, you had to go through the passing on of learning these skills and how to be an artist. So that's what she's faced with. It's just not going to happen for her.
No, it come quite a number of years later when, unfortunately, she would no longer be with us. So there is a lot about the porcelain industry. How much of the idea about shades and discovering what other factions were doing is based on fact?
The rivalries between porcelain houses and the spying is all based on fact. And then the colors. I found some wonderful stories about color, like the man in Germany who discovered Prussian blue kept the formula to himself and absolutely wouldn't share it with anybody. And finally, somebody stole it. And so there was at Sèvres porcelain, which was the finest and most prestigious of all of them at this time in France, that Madame de Pompadour got off the ground. There was some of the best scientists of France were put to work coming up with shades. Like there's Pompadour pink, which she insisted on having for herself. So, people were kind of conscripted, great scientific minds, because science and art were sort of, very close during this time. I don't know if they've ever been closer. So, I don't want to give away the origin of the formula in the book, but that was very much based on reality. It was just that I moved the timeline a little bit to my advantage. That's all I'll say there. But there are some wonderful, wonderful nonfiction books out there about color. And blue is by far the most fascinating of them all. And, there was a time where there wasn't hardly any blue paint because it's the one color you can't get from nature as a pigment. They were getting it literally out of Afghanistan caves in medieval time, grinding it up and making it into beautiful blues for some of the main religious painters. For the Virgin Mary would have a beautiful blue dress or something. But you just didn't see much blue because it was so hard. It was so hard to create.
So Genevieve's grandfather's surname is Billiou. There's a story there, isn't there?
Oh, yes. Well, originally when I wrote this book, I wanted to use my father's family. And we are descended from a Billiou family that came over in the 1650s. He started in France, then he went to the Netherlands, and then he sailed with his wife and several children to what was then New Amsterdam, which is now where I'm sitting, New York City. But the English were not yet running it. It was a Dutch port when he arrived. And the French and the Dutch were pretty much running things way back then. But there were all sorts of people here. There was there were Jews in the 1650s, 1660s in New York. There were some Catholics, and there were unfortunately slaves. There were a lot of different people in this port town. And so anyway, Pierre built a stone house. It's still standing, although I have nothing to do with it, myself. But I am the only Billiou living in the New York area. So once in a while, when they do historical society events around the house, trying to raise money for a roof or something, they'll trot me out. I'm like, hello. So Pierre,
no, that's lovely.
Yeah, like hello. But it's owned by the state, and it's on the National Register. But it's very small. It's white brick, and it's basically 2 rooms, one of them very long with a huge fireplace at the end. And I think about somebody who raised 4 or 5 children, basically in one room. So I think about that. That would be hard. When I first wrote the book, I wanted to get a little bit of my family name in there. And I wanted to, it was too late for Pierre, but I wanted to use that name. So I wrote the first part in New York. But what happened was an agent saw it and said, this book has to be a thriller. You've got a 2-month ocean voyage between America. Because I always wanted to get her over to the pacing. It's just not going to work. And so you can't use America. It has to just be in Europe if it's going to be a thriller. You're going to kill your timing with the ocean voyage. There's no Learjet. She was right. So I then looked into Spitalfields, which, that's an amazing place. And the silk weaver heritage that's still being sort of honored and researched. And there's festivals. And in fact, the Huguenot Museum sells my book along with a couple of other novels that have Huguenot characters, which I think is awesome.
So moving on to Dreamland. Shall we have a reading, which is from the prologue?
Okay. The phantom city vanished an hour after midnight. The 1,000,000 lights of Dreamland darkened as they always did, with a clang as loud as a cannon shot, followed by a long, wheezing gush. The rides, the attractions, the sideshows, the restaurants, the dance hall, the entire 15-acre fairground stretching from the canals of Venice to Lilliput, all of it had been shut down for the night. Once they'd thrown the switch on the light panels, it didn't take long for the heat created by the electric bulbs to dissipate, replaced by the cool, salt-flavored ocean breeze. But the smell of the fairground hung on. Nothing could drive away the scent of stale popcorn, roasted peanuts, taffy and cotton candy, fried crab, boiled corn and beer, mingling with the odor of greasy machinery and rank human sweat. That was the fragrance of Coney Island, and no one ever forgot it. The customers trudged home, and the exhausted park workers stumbled to the narrow beds in their apartment houses in Brooklyn. It was dark and still on the fairgrounds. This was the time when the night policeman made his rounds. The beach was on his left and Dreamland on his right. The seagulls, his only companions, hopped in the sand. But then, in the moonlight, past the bathing pavilions, he saw the 2 human figures halfway down the beach, walking slowly toward the water's edge. It was a silhouette of a man, his arm around the waist of a woman wearing a long, dark dress that, in the moonlight, stood out against the white sand. The policeman smiled to himself as the couple sank into the sand. Hadn't he courted his wife the same way? That was 20 years ago, and he still looked forward to coming home, taking off his uniform, and sliding into bed next to her as she slept, the springs creaking as he kissed her soft shoulder. The policeman kept walking, headed toward Luna Park, where the chutes and helter-skelter were rendered motionless until morning. He didn't hear the woman in the sand, a sharp, startled cry. A few minutes later, there was a different noise, a splash in the water. No one saw the man walk up the beach and onto the promenade, alone.
So, Dreamland, this is your latest novel. It's set in Coney Island, New York, in 1911, and it's about a reluctant heiress, Peggy, who has to stop working in a bookshop in order to join her family on a sudden holiday, which they are going on to keep her sister's fiancé's family interested in the alliance. Now, I don't want to say too much, so I'm going to leave it to you, Nancy, if you'd like to introduce any more of it.
Let's see. Well, I did use as my inspiration for the main character of Peggy, a real heiress, Peggy Guggenheim. She's loosely inspired by Peggy Guggenheim, but I found the Guggenheim family, and I found some of the other families of that time. We're talking the very early 20th century. I found the Morgans, J.P. Morgan and the
Mm.
Rockefellers. I found these families really interesting. Just the amounts of money they were able to make, but it was not without some conflict, tension, and consequences. And also, I know everyone's fascinated with the Astors and the Vanderbilts, and that's interesting too, that the wives became obsessed with building the largest mansions that could possibly be created and putting them on Fifth Avenue, and some of them are still, visible today. But I found the real life families that were in New York then really interesting. And one thing that's in this book that I found that really amused me was that when people wanted to be writers or artists back then, they left New York almost immediately. And they went to Europe, Henry James and so forth. It's just, there was this feeling like this was a backwater in 1911. The skyscrapers were the leading expression of the city, just size and modernness, modern technology, and just sort of a growing culture's urge to show off. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, they had almost no paintings by living artists. It was all old masters. There was just this insecurity about what New York was, even though it was poised to become like this major city. It was not quite one then, not quite. And I found that a very interesting, tense time. And what I did was I picked Coney Island because I stumbled on the fact that when Coney Island was becoming Coney Island, America's playground and world famous, fantastical place of exhibits and carnivals and animals and, a hotel shaped like an elephant and so forth, all these wild things. There was also, less than a mile away, there were still these very grand Edwardian era hotels where the rich people would come and stay, and they'd have their lobster and their champagne, and they would be protected by Pinkerton guards, from the mob down the road. And that's the whole basis of the book, was I wanted to make these two worlds collide. The growing, surging, immigrant-fueled, vital New York, people coming out there to have a great time and flirt and jump in the waves and go nuts. And then there were still these people wearing corsets over here and having lobster and being very proper and very angry, really interesting, about immigration, about the working class, and women shouldn't have the vote. And there was this feeling then if women went to university, they'd be less feminine, and just all. And this was all still happening in 1910, right up to World War I. So I just thought these two worlds really, but they were coexisting in Coney Island to a degree that was like extreme. I mean, in New York, you have all kinds of people right next to each other all the time. But I wanted to set a novel in there, and I also wanted to set a novel in my hometown. The Billiou wasn't able to bring anything in, but I wanted to do that and see what it was like. But I always go back in time, so it wasn't going to be a modern novel. I don't feel the need to do that, but I love to go back in time.
So at some point, then you're going to have to write the ship novel in between these two books.
I know. I'm not sure how, but you're right. It has to happen.
So yeah, you say about the clothes. I actually struggled sometimes where it was so summery, and I loved this. I think this personal opinion. It's your best book so far. I think the sights and sounds of this book, they're just constantly there with you, and it's really easy to get engrossed because it's just so immersive. But you saying about the clothes and the difference and that, I did find it difficult when Peggy would be nearer the shore, I suppose, to not picture her in like shorts and t-shirt. And I'm thinking, no, of course she's in corsets,
No. And it was so hot. There was a real heat wave that I lucked into it wasn't lucky for the people who were in it, but it was so terrible that some people just literally died of it. And I'm not talking about, the unfortunate older people or the sick people who always die in a heat wave, but people just couldn't stand it. And people who couldn't swim would throw themselves into rivers. People would shoot themselves. I mean, they couldn't stand it. And you think about no air conditioning. And, in New York and in the Northeast, when it gets really hot and when it's muggy like that, it's difficult. And so the rich people had fans. That's how the Peggy and her set sort of survived this heat wave. But yeah, that's what I want to do. I wanted to get the really rich and the working class on the same stretch of land in a heat wave and see what happens.
So there is a mystery in this book. We will leave it there. That there is a definite mystery. It's very thrilling. So we will leave that there. Dreamland. Now, there is another book that you've just published. So while we wait for these very long 3 days to pass, your newest novella, The Ghost of Madison Avenue. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I wanted to do something with the J.P. Morgan Private Library. It's an amazing place. It's still there. It was turned into a museum. He was the most powerful banker by a long shot in the U.S., and he did things like finance U.S. Steel, over railroads. You know, he was like this person who was actually more important than the president. And he had this private library. As he became older, he got tired of all of this responsibility, and he really just wanted to collect things. Now, he didn't want to necessarily collect a lot of paintings. He had a lot of rare books, illuminated manuscripts, and other things. And he had this architect build this beautiful sort of temple to himself to put all of his collection in. And so I wanted to write a mini mystery. It's just a novella and a ghost story, and it's also a love story. So for that, I turned back to my mother's side of the family. You can see I'm mining my family left, right, and center. But my mother's name is Mary Elizabeth O'Neill, and she is descended from someone who came over in the middle of the potato famine from Ireland. And the Irish immigration into New York is profound. And around the turn of the century, 25% of the people who lived in New York were Irish. Now it's much less now. And people have intermarried so much that I don't even know now what it means to be Irish American. I mean, I literally don't know, like, how much of your background has to be from Ireland to be Irish American. But during that time, there was sort of this upward mobility. This is 1912, where it's not like that Martin Scorsese movie anymore, Gangs of New York, where they're, fighting in the streets and everybody's like picking on them. But, they've now they're the police, they're the teachers. They're moving up. They're still not WASPs. They're not the mayor, but they are they're upwardly mobile. So I picked a woman, did a main character who lives in the Bronx with her family, and I used a lot of Irish American research there and also some family stuff. I was called on this by one of my cousins. It's true that I talk about how tasteless the roast was. The problem is, I sat through some really tasteless meals as a child, where you just put a piece of meat in the oven and then take it out, no taste. So this
don't show your mum this podcast when it goes out, will you?
No. She'll handle it. So anyway, I just put it out there as something to sort of transition into early New York as a setting for fiction, to sort of kick off Dreamland, which I'm really excited about. But also it has some elements of The Crown in there. I have a Dominican monastery, yay, real life one that's still there in the Bronx. So I felt like I just missed my nuns. I just wanted to bring in a nun. And so it's a kind of a way where I'm going forward, but I'm still, I really loved writing that trilogy. And so I haven't gotten it completely out of my system, and I haven't given up on the thought of doing something like the trilogy someday again.
Awesome. Yeah,
it would be fun to go back down that road.
So after having used these 3 periods of history, putting The Ghost of Madison Avenue together with Dreamland for a moment, do you have a favorite?
Well, even though I loved the Billiou writing it, the 18th century was not my favorite. It's hard. The Enlightenment is hard to write about. It's hard because it's a lot of concept and theory. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And trying to bring it into a sensory, pragmatic, real life thing was difficult. And also, I hope I don't offend anyone, but I don't find the early Georgian kings very fun. That's why I was running over to grab Madame de Pompadour, to find some glamour. But so even though I love that book, that's not my favorite time period. and I don't know if I would, I might write another 18th century book, but I'd probably do it in the US. I do like the early 20th century, but I guess I like the Tudors and the early 20th century kind of equally, I mean, they're just so different. And like I said, I haven't exhausted my interest in the 16th century, but I'm having fun because the thing is that a lot of people like the Tudors and a lot of people have read a lot about it. And, I'm Tudor Scribe on Twitter, and, people are sharing little tidbits about the 16th century all day long, and academics or just novelists and fans. And it's just a conversation that just doesn't stop. And that's really amazing. But I feel like in the early 20th century in New York, the US, and in England, that a lot of really interesting stuff's happening. I just saw the movie 1917, which I thought was really good. And I just think that this time period also can really take off in fiction, in a way that it quite hasn't, So I just think that it's an exciting time to be writing it.
So unfortunately, we have run out of time. Nancy, it has been wonderful having you here and discussing your work. And I'm thrilled you've been here to talk about your Tudor books. It has been wonderful. If you want to start a podcast on Tudor history, that would be fantastic. The Joanna Stafford trilogy, as well as the Blue, are out now, as is The Ghost of Madison Avenue. It's on Amazon. Dreamland is available to pre-order. You'll receive it very, very shortly. Links to all books are in the podcast description. Nancy, thank you.
Thank you. I'm really glad you asked me to do this.
Join me on Monday, the 27th of January, when I will be talking to Elizabeth E.C. Freemantle, author of The Poison Bed. The Wormhole Podcast, Episode 6, was recorded on the 5th of January and published on the 13th of January 2020. Music and production by Charlie Place.